boxing publications don't really hold much sway over the public anymore. They don't have much influence over public perception and public opinion because it's mainly online now. That's where most boxing fans digest their boxing media. But back in the days when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, the boxing publications were the center of everything in the world of a boxing fan. So every hardcore boxing fan was reading the Ring magazine, and they knew who the Ring magazine had in their top 10 for every division or pound for pound. People was reading KO magazine. People were reading Boxing Monthly, Boxing News, Boxing Illustrated and stuff like that. So back then, the publications had a big influence over the opinions of boxing fans and the perceptions of boxing fans. And one of the things I noticed, which used to frustrate the hell out of me back in the days, was how biased the American boxing publications were for the most part. Bias in favor of American fighters and bias against foreign fighters, particularly British fighters. And an example of this would be the rivalry between Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe. The way that Lewis was treated by the American boxing press, and I have to make a distinction here because Lewis was promoted in America by the Duvers and he was on HBO. He had a deal with them. HBO obviously spoke highly of Lewis because he was their fighter. I'm not talking about HBO. I'm talking about the boxing press, the KO magazine, Ring magazine, Boxing Illustrated, etc. The journalists out there, the hardcore boxing hacks. They had an extremely critical eye towards Lennox Lewis. So Lewis beat Riddick Bowe in the Olympic finals in Korea, in Seoul, 1988. After that, Riddick Bowe actually came in for a tremendous amount of criticism himself. At the time, Lewis represented Canada. Obviously, Lewis was born in the UK, moved to Canada around the age of 12, had his amateur career there, won Olympic gold for Canada. On the podium, Riddick Bowe famously turned to Lennox Lewis and said, "See you in the pros." So when Bowe turned pro, they both turned pro, Lewis and Bowe. Bowe came under a lot of criticism from the American media, from the boxing press. So much so that Eddie Futch was advised by many people in boxing to stay away from Riddick Bowe. People said that Bowe didn't have the heart, he didn't have the desire. There have been rumors for many years that Bowe was getting beaten up in sparring by people like Tyrell Biggs. Evander Holyfield was supposed to have given Bowe the business in sparring when Bowe was young, like 17, 18. But still, all of these stories led a lot of people in the American boxing media to kind of write Riddick Bowe off a little bit. They were so disappointed that he didn't get the gold. I believe he was favorite to get the gold in Seoul, but he never got the gold. Lewis took it, and they questioned Bowe's heart. They questioned his commitment. They questioned his stamina, all kind of stuff. They questioned his chin. And when Bowe was rising up through the ranks as a pro, he started winning some of the American media over, but there was still a lot of skepticism. So, for example, when he fought Tyrell Biggs, Biggs at the time was on his way out. I mean, Biggs was pretty much on his way out after he won the Olympic gold, truth be told, because he had a crack cocaine problem. You can go read up about it. Tyrell Biggs, after winning Olympic gold, disappeared off into the night to go score some crack and go smoke it somewhere. That's how messed up it was for Tyrell Biggs. And as a pro, he continued on with his crack cocaine use, which is why the Duvers threw Tyrell Biggs in so early on in his career against Mike Tyson, because he didn't look good in his previous fight against David Bay, where he suffered a bad cut. Coming off such a lackluster performance, why would they throw him straight in with Tyson? When that was, Biggs' 15th fight or something like that. Tyson had, I think, 30 odd fights at the time. So yeah, it was because of his crack cocaine problem. Anyway, years later, Biggs fought Riddick Bowe. Biggs was definitely on the decline, but he managed to shake Riddick Bowe in that fight. He hit him with a shot, and Biggs was not known as a big puncher. He buzzed Riddick Bowe. So that again led to criticism of Big Daddy, as they used to call him. He also had a fight against Tony Tubbs. Tubbs had seen better days, but a lot of people felt that Tubbs actually won that fight and Riddick Bowe got a gift decision. So again, even though he was building up a certain amount of support in America, and there was some of the American boxing press who liked Riddick Bowe, there was still a lot of question marks. I think Rock Newman, Riddick Bowe's manager, really helped in terms of winning a lot of people in America over because he was a very larger than life character, Rock Newman. He was always, sounding the horn for Riddick Bowe. I remember when Riddick Bowe fought Elijah Tillery. I swear he fought him twice. One of the fights against Elijah Tillery, at the end of the first round, Tillery stuck his tongue out at Riddick Bowe, and Bowe kind of flicked one of his gloves in Tillery's face as if to say, don't be rude to me like that. You know what I mean? Sticking your tongue out at me. Tillery then kicked Riddick Bowe, and then Bowe went for Tillery. And as Tillery was backing up towards the rope, still throwing kicks at Bowe, Bowe's manager, Rock Newman, got up on the ring apron and he grabbed Elijah Tillery round the neck and held him there so Riddick Bowe could come and smash him. That's the kind of character Rock Newman was. And by the way, Riddick Bowe throughout his career showed that his fans were some terrible, terrible people. I mean, I can't say every individual, but on a whole, Riddick Bowe fans were badly behaved. And there was just an air of chaos around a lot of Riddick Bowe fights. I'll come on to that a little bit later on. But as he was building his way up to his title shot against Holyfield, there was still skepticism in the American media. Then he beat Holyfield and he answered a lot of questions. He answered questions about his heart, about his stamina, about his commitment, all that. And I can't remember who was favorite for that fight. I think Holyfield might have been a marginal favorite going into the Riddick Bowe fight. I can't remember, but it was fairly close, relatively so, by way of betting odds. Bowe came through, and Lewis, a few months earlier, Lennox Lewis, had just knocked out Razor Ruddock in a final eliminator for the WBC, which Riddick Bowe now held after beating Holyfield. And the Americans were pretty respectful of Lewis because he put in a very impressive performance against Razor Ruddock. Ruddock was touted by many people as the most dangerous heavyweight other than Mike Tyson, who just gone to prison. So there was a certain amount of respect there from the American media towards Lennox Lewis. But once Lewis and Riddick Bowe rekindled their rivalry, you could see a change in the American boxing media. And again, I'm talking about the boxing media specifically. I don't know what the New York Times or some of the mainstream media in America was saying, but with regards to the boxing media, I noticed a change in the way that they spoke about Lennox Lewis and their attitude towards Lennox Lewis once Lewis and Bowe rekindled their rivalry as pros. And that rivalry really rekindled at ringside after Bowe Holyfield won, because Lewis was doing commentary for that fight. And as Bowe was leaving the ring, he kind of stood there, where Lewis was doing commentary, and he started talking some smack to Lewis. Lewis stood up and they had a little face-off. And Riddick Bowe was still kind of buzzing off the adrenaline from his fight against Holyfield. So that's where the rivalry really rekindled officially. And as I say, the American media then changed their attitude towards Lewis. And it became a situation where Lewis had to do twice as much as Riddick Bowe just to get half the amount of credit. There were certain things that Riddick Bowe was doing wrong in and out of the ring that were swept under the carpet. But if Lewis did something similar, rather than sweeping his wrongs under the carpet, they were magnified and they were focused upon by the American boxing media. So you saw this biasness, which used to drive me up the wall with the American media. Now, look, the UK media were, and I'm talking about boxing media, they were also biased to some extent, but nowhere near as blatantly and as over the top as the American boxing media were biased. The UK boxing media would give American fighters and foreign fighters in general much more of a fair shake than the American boxing publications would. Again, let me not say media, let me say publications, because media, people are going to think about television, and HBO were definitely accepting of a certain amount of foreign fighters. Some foreign fighters they were skeptical of, like Vitaly Klitschko, for example. But anyway, so this rivalry rekindled. And after Bowe won that undisputed title against Holyfield in 1992, he was supposed to fight Lennox Lewis, who was his mandatory challenger. And obviously his former amateur nemesis, get revenge over him. That's what Riddick Bowe was supposed to do. But instead, he famously dumped his WBC belt in the trash and refused to face Lennox Lewis. He vacated his belt rather than face the mandatory challenger. Now, that is an indefensible move, surely. The entire boxing press in America should have been destroying Riddick Bowe over that. Now, some of them did criticize him, but a lot of them were making excuses for him, which is crazy. It makes no logical sense to make excuses for a guy who just ducked his mandatory challenger and threw the belt in the bin. But some of them were starting to edge towards Riddick Bowe and take his side, bizarrely. Bowe and his manager, Rock Newman, had successfully conned a lot of the American media and therefore the public, because again, the American boxing press was the center of the world for a lot of boxing fans. They had a massive influence over people's perceptions. So Bowe and Rock Newman basically took advantage of the patriotism within the American boxing press, which was stoked up after the rivalry with Lewis came up again. It got their, patriotic juices flowing, and they thought, okay, there's a threat here from a Brit, so we better back our American boy and be extra critical of the Brit. And that's what they started doing more and more as time went on. So that was the first red flag right there, when they started making excuses for Bowe ducking Lewis and throwing his WBC belt in the trash. Then the next year, in 1993, Bowe lost his rematch to Holyfield, but many in the American boxing press just regarded it as a blip because Bowe was thought to have slacked in training. Most still regarded Bowe as the man in the heavyweight division at that point. Bear in mind, Bowe had defended against Michael Dokes, who was way over the hill, and Jesse Ferguson, and he'd stopped them both early. So he hadn't been beating anybody. Lewis had beaten Tony Tucker in his first defense of the WBC because obviously WBC became vacant. It was awarded to Lewis because he won a final eliminator against Razor Ruddock. He had his first defense against Tucker. And look, Tucker had seen better days, but he'd only lost one fight. He didn't have the wear and tear on him that Michael Dokes and Jesse Ferguson had. But yet the American boxing press were extremely critical of Lewis's performance against Tony Tucker. It went the distance, and Tucker actually had some success late in that fight. They were extremely critical of that performance. They were acting like Lewis should have done a similar job to Tucker to what Riddick Bowe did to Dokes and Jesse Ferguson. Then, as I say, when Riddick Bowe lost to Holyfield in the rematch, they said, oh, well, Riddick Bowe doesn't really like to train and so on and so forth. So he's still the man. He just had a little blip. That was the general attitude that the American boxing press had. Lennox Lewis, on the other hand, by this point, because of the trash talk coming from Riddick Bowe and Rock Newman, the American press were now basically calling Lewis a chinny Brit and a hype job who couldn't fight. It's amazing how their opinion of him deteriorated so rapidly between the Razor Ruddock fight and, let's say, the Frank Bruno fight and the Phil Jackson fight, which is the fight he had after Frank Bruno. So his reputation among the American press was deteriorating. Now, obviously, he fought Bruno. It was a tough fight. Had to take some shots. Fought Phil Jackson. I remember Mike Katz, who's a well-known American boxing journalist, and he was at the Lewis-Phil Jackson fight, and he said, none of these guys can fight. This guy's no good. Lennox Lewis is not a good fighter. We have to pray for Mike Tyson to come out of prison to save their heavyweight division because none of these guys can fight. I remember Mike Katz saying that on camera back then. But anyway, particularly Lennox Lewis, he was under way more criticism than Riddick Bowe was. So and by the way, I was watching a Boxing Beats and Rhymes live stream, and he referred to the term horizontal heavyweight. This is a term that the American press used to use for British heavyweights back in the days. And in fact, Lennox Lewis released an autobiography in the early 90s. I can't remember, it might just be called Lennox Lewis, My Autobiography. I can't remember the exact name. But the front cover has got Lennox Lewis on the front, kind of sitting down with his arms folded, looking at the camera, and he's got his WBC belt in front of him. And in that autobiography, there's a chapter called The Horizontal Heavyweight. But yeah, that was actually the first time I remember reading that term or hearing about that term, the horizontal heavyweight. Anyway, Lewis eventually lost to Oliver McCall in 1994. He was stopped in 2 rounds. And of course, as you would expect, Riddick Bowe, Rock Newman, and the American press were quick to jump up and say, we told you so. We told you he was a hype job and he couldn't fight and he was chinny. They had this thing that Lewis was chinny even before Lewis had ever been dropped in a fight. It's like, how can you say the guy's chinny when he's never been down in a pro ring? But their rationale was he's British. And we all know British heavyweights can't take a punch. Hence the term, the horizontal heavyweight that they have for British fighters. Anyway, he lost to McCall. Bowe and the American press, Rock Newman, they're all writing Lewis off. At this point, the narrative is Riddick Bowe is the truth. He's the guy who is the heir apparent to Mike Tyson, and the only guy who's going to be able to give Mike Tyson work when he comes out of prison is Riddick Bowe. This is the narrative they were pushing in the American boxing press. Lewis was just a flash in the pan. He's not the real deal. We already got that in Holyfield, right? And we got Big Daddy and Bowe. These are real fighters. That Brit over there was just hot air. Bowe is the one who's going to go on to have a Hall of Fame career. Okay, this is the narrative they were pushing. So Riddick Bowe went on, after the rematch to Holyfield where he lost on points, he went on to pick up the then lightly regarded WBO title in March 95. He knocked out Herbie Hyde in 6 rounds. The WBO at the time was the equivalent of the IBO today. Nobody took it seriously back then. In June of that same year, 95, Bowe turned in probably his career best performance since the first Holyfield fight when he beat the previously unbeaten Cuban amateur standout Jorge Luis Gonzalez. That was a brutal KO in 6 rounds. So he was looking good at this point, Riddick Bowe. So the hype around Bowe and the praise he was getting was even more monumental than it was from the first Holyfield fight at this stage. And again, now they were looking to match Riddick Bowe up against Mike Tyson, who was released earlier that year in 1995 from prison. They were looking to have this big mega fight between Riddick Bowe and Mike Tyson. But things were not quite what they seemed. People's perceptions were not actually that close to reality. And Bowe ended up looking shockingly vulnerable in his third fight with Evander Holyfield in November of that year. So after putting in this great performance against Gonzalez, he then fights Holyfield for a third time, and Holyfield didn't look great in that fight, but he managed to drop Riddick Bowe for the first time in his career. And remember, Holyfield, for pretty much his entire heavyweight run, was constantly criticized for his lack of punching power. But yet here we have him hitting Riddick Bowe in the chin with a left hook and dropping him, and Riddick Bowe was finished. He was done. When he got up to his feet, his legs were all over the place. But Holyfield didn't have it in the gas tank to finish Riddick Bowe off. It was one of the strangest things you'll ever see, where Bowe's clearly there for the taking, and Holyfield just can't put any punches together. He actually talked about it after the fight. It was after the third fight against Riddick Bowe that Holyfield was diagnosed with having some kind of heart condition. And he says that's the reason that he wasn't able to put any punches together and finish Bowe off. But again, Bowe's chin, even though Lewis had fought many more big punches than Riddick Bowe had fought, but Bowe never really fought any punches, truth be told. Throughout his whole career, I'm struggling to think of the punches that Riddick Bowe fought. He fought Andrew Golota, who was a decent puncher, but not a murderous puncher. Other than Golota, Gonzalez was a decent puncher, but there's no real serious punches. Lewis was fighting serious punches. Bowe gets dropped by Holyfield, whose power is lightly regarded, and the American boxing press, they don't really question Bowe's chin still. Okay, at this stage, again, they're blinded by patriotism. So he looked vulnerable in that Holyfield fight, but he did get back up on his feet and he went on to stop Holyfield in the 8th. But the first signs of decline had started to appear in Riddick Bowe. Never before had he looked that vulnerable. In 96, things got even worse, because in what was supposed to be little more than a showcase, Bowe found himself on the wrong end of a shocking beating at the hands of, at the time, unheralded Polish heavyweight Andrew Golota. Bowe looked on his way to his second pro defeat, but was miraculously spared by a bizarre turn of events. That's the only way I can describe it. A bizarre turn of events which saw Andrew Golota get himself disqualified in the 7th round. And after that, there was a massive riot in the arena with Riddick Bowe fans against Golota fans. Very, very violent, terrible scenes. Andrew Golota's trainer Lou Duva, or one of his trainers anyway, Lou Duva, because he was also working with Roger Bloodworth. Lou Duva, I think he had a heart attack, or he certainly passed out in the ring. It was very, very ugly scenes in Madison Square Garden that night. And another example of how ill-behaved Riddick Bowe fans tended to be. So 5 months later, they had a rematch, Bowe and Golota. Bowe had more success in a rematch, but he also took more punishment, right? The rematch was absolutely brutal. Both guys got dropped. Andrew Golota was up on the cards, but inexplicably, incredibly, the unthinkable happened, and Golota got himself disqualified again for the very same reason, repeated low blows, this time in the 9th round. So after those back-to-back brutal fights, it was really 3 brutal fights back-to-back. The 3rd fight with Holyfield and the 2 fights with Golota, brutal fights for Riddick Bowe. At that stage, Riddick Bowe's career was effectively over. I mean, he did return to fight, 3 or 4 more times a few years down the line, but he was never the same again. Andrew Golota, on the other hand, went on to challenge Lennox Lewis for the WBC heavyweight title in 1997. Lewis had managed to avenge his loss to Oliver McCall and recaptured the vacant WBC title in the process. It wasn't an immediate rematch. Lewis fought several people between the 1st and 2nd McCall fights, but still, he fought McCall for the vacant WBC belt in the rematch, won that, and he defended against Andrew Golota. And going into the fight, given the beating Golota had dished out to Riddick Bowe twice, he was favored by many in the American press to beat Lennox Lewis, and many of the American public as well. Lewis, however, had other ideas, and he turned in his best career performance since he gatecrashed the heavyweight scene back in 92 with his stunning knockout over Razor Ruddock in 2 rounds. In an uncharacteristic display of early aggression, Lewis blasted out the crazy pole, as they used to call him then, Golota, in just 95 seconds of the 1st round. And then Lewis would later go on to become the undisputed heavyweight champion and establish himself as the best heavyweight of that era. So again, people's perceptions in the American boxing media and the American public in terms of who the better heavyweight was way off. They all wrote Lewis off as a hype job with no chin, a horizontal British heavyweight, that Riddick Bowe's going to be the one who gets in there and fights Tyson and has this Hall of Fame career. The exact opposite happened. The American boxing media and therefore the public couldn't see through their own patriotism. They were blinded by it. Bowe ended up washed up pretty much by the age of 29. He was done. And despite finishing with a respectable record of 43-1, Bowe never delivered on his early promise. The mega fights with Tyson and Lewis never materialized, and he would go down in history as what many regarded as a wasted talent. So there are lessons there to be learned. First of all, the biasness of American boxing media. It's notorious because I remember it, as I say, from the 80s and 90s with the Lewis-Bowe beef, how incredibly biased they were, how they misled the public, not just in America, but even in the UK. Some people were buying into the narratives that the American boxing press was spinning. People read Ring Magazine and KO Magazine, etc., like it was gospel, the articles they were writing in there, the narratives they were pushing. And as I say, they turned out to be completely wrong. Be careful when people are pushing a narrative. Understand that until all the top fighters have fought each other, there is no number one. Things can look a certain way today, but a couple years down the line, when you look back in retrospect, you realize it was totally different to how you thought it was. Lewis was written off after the first Oliver McCall fight when he got knocked out in 2 rounds. Never in a million years did most people think that he would go on to have a better career than Riddick Bowe, that he would be the guy to go on and beat Holyfield, beat Mike Tyson, have X amount of defenses of his heavyweight title. Nobody would have thought that at the time. But that's why it ain't over until the fat lady sings. Let that be a lesson to people from history. So yeah, just a little bit of nostalgia there for you guys. Take from it what you will. Catch you guys in the next video. It's happening. I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week. covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.